Welcome to History Zettel. If you are new here, this channel investigates the forgotten operations, unsolved mysteries, and buried evidence of the Second World War. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next case. In the early hours of September the 1st, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border, and one of the most devastating military campaigns in modern history began. As panzer columns carved through Polish defenses, a small group of men in Warsaw were destroying everything they had built over the previous 7 years. They burned their files, smashed their equipment, and fled south through Romania. They were not soldiers, they were mathematicians, and what they carried in their heads was worth more to the Allied cause than any division of infantry. This is the story of the most consequential intelligence operation in history. It is the story of a machine that the Germans believed was mathematically unbreakable. It is the story of the people who proved them wrong, and the extraordinary lengths to which the Allies went to keep that fact hidden for 30 years after the war ended. It begins not in England, but in Poland, in the autumn of 1932. Captain Maksymilian Czeski, head of the cipher section of the Polish General Staff Cipher Bureau in Warsaw, had become convinced of something that most of his contemporaries thought was eccentric, that the future of code-breaking lay not with linguists and classical scholars, but with mathematicians. Germany's military communications had been growing increasingly impenetrable throughout the late 1920s, and Czeski believed he understood why. In 1928, the German military had adopted the Enigma machine, a device originally developed for commercial banking, and had modified it into what they believed was the most secure cipher system ever built. The Enigma machine looked at first glance like a peculiar typewriter. When an operator pressed a key, an electrical signal passed through a series of rotating wheels called rotors, then through a fixed reflector plate, then back through the rotors again, before illuminating a different letter on a lamp panel. The receiving operator, working with an identical machine set to identical daily settings, would press the illuminated letter, and the original message would emerge. The mathematical elegance of the system lay in the rotors themselves. Each time a key was pressed, at least one rotor advanced by one position, meaning that the same letter pressed twice in succession would produce two entirely different cipher letters. With 3 rotors chosen from a set of 5, a plug board that further scrambled letter connections, and settings that were changed every 24 hours, German cryptographers calculated that the number of possible configurations ran to approximately 10 quadrillion. German intelligence investigators reviewed the system in detail and delivered a confident verdict. The Enigma code was unbreakable. They were mistaken. Czeski had sent 3 of his brightest young mathematicians to study cryptology at Poznan University, a city that had been part of Germany until 1918 and where the students had grown up speaking German fluently. In September 1932, 27-year-old Marian Rejewski, along with his colleagues Jerzy Rosicki and Henryk Zygalski, joined the Cipher Bureau in Warsaw. Their task was to crack the military Enigma. They had no Enigma machine. They had no prior knowledge of its wiring. Rejewski's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. French military intelligence had recruited a German spy inside the Reich Cipher office in Berlin. His name was Hans Thilo Schmidt, a minor official who had fallen into serious financial difficulties and agreed to photograph secret documents for the French. Among the documents he provided were the Enigma operating manuals for September and October 1932, along with the daily key settings used during those months. The French, who had already attempted to use this material themselves and failed, passed it to their Polish allies. Gustave Bertrand of French military intelligence delivered the documents personally to the Polish Cipher Bureau in December 1932. The documents were not in themselves sufficient to reconstruct the Enigma's wiring, but they were enough to dramatically reduce the mathematical unknowns in Rejewski's equations. Working alone, applying the theory of permutation groups in ways that had never before been applied to cryptanalysis. Rejewski solved the internal wiring of the machine's rotors in a matter of weeks. He later wrote that the solution depended partly on a stroke of inspired guesswork about how the military Enigma's entry wheel was configured. His guess was correct. By late December 1932, Marian Rejewski had mathematically reconstructed a machine he had never seen, from nothing but intercepted messages and a collection of expired key settings. Over the following 6 years, the three Polish mathematicians developed increasingly sophisticated tools to industrialize their code breaking. They invented the cyclometer, a mechanical device that could catalog all 105,000 possible rotor configurations. They filled entire card catalogs with the characteristics of these settings. Rejewski then designed the Bomba, a cluster of 6 interconnected Enigma replicas that could search automatically through rotor combinations. And by 1938, the Cipher Bureau was reading approximately 75% of all intercepted German Enigma traffic. Then, in December 1938, the Germans made the first of what would be a series of successive improvements to the machine. They introduced 2 new rotors, expanding the possible rotor arrangements from 6 to 60. 10 times as many bombas would be needed to maintain the same rate of decryption, and the Poles did not have the resources to build them. In April 1939, Germany withdrew from its non-aggression treaty with Poland. With invasion clearly imminent, Guido Langer, the head of the Cipher Bureau, made a decision of historic importance. On the 26th and 27th of July 1939, at a conference in the forest outside Warsaw, Langer invited British and French intelligence representatives and revealed everything. The British delegation included Dilly Knox, a veteran codebreaker from Bletchley Park, who had himself been working fruitlessly on the Enigma problem for years. When the Polish mathematicians demonstrated their reconstruction of the machine and their catalog systems, Knox was visibly shaken. He had spent months attempting to solve the entry wheel problem by assuming the letters were wired in keyboard order, exactly the assumption that Rejewski had already correctly solved. Gordon Welchman, who would later head the Army and Air Force section at Bletchley Park, wrote subsequently that the British code-breaking effort would never have gotten off the ground if we had not learned from the Poles in the nick of time. 5 weeks later, Germany invaded Poland. Rejewski, Rosicki, and Zygalski escaped through Romania to France. The blueprints of their bombas and 2 Polish reconstructed Enigma machines were delivered to Britain just before the borders closed. 5 weeks after that, the Government Code and Cipher School moved from London to a Victorian mansion house in Buckinghamshire called Bletchley Park, which the Secret Intelligence Service had quietly purchased from a property developer the previous year. The official cover story described it as a government communications headquarters. Inside the code-breaking community, it was known simply as Station X. The Bletchley Park of September 1939 was a modest operation. Around 200 personnel worked in cramped conditions in the mansion's original rooms. The recruits were drawn largely from Cambridge and Oxford universities, where mathematics and classical dons had been quietly identified and approached through personal contacts. Alan Turing, a Cambridge mathematician who had already published groundbreaking theoretical work on computation, reported for duty on the 4th of September 1939, the day after Britain declared war. Gordon Welchman arrived alongside him. They joined Dilly Knox in the research section and immediately set to work extending the Polish methods. The problem facing Bletchley Park in those first months was a fundamental one. The Polish system for breaking Enigma had relied on a specific German procedural error. Operators had been required to encipher each day's message key twice, creating a mathematically exploitable repetition. In May 1940, the Germans eliminated this practice. The entire foundation of the Polish approach collapsed overnight. Turing had anticipated this possibility, however, and had been working on a different attack method that did not rely on the repeated key. His approach was based on what the codebreakers called cribs, predictable phrases that were likely to appear in German messages at known positions. By finding a crib in an intercepted message and testing it against all possible Enigma settings, it was theoretically possible to identify the correct configuration for that day. The practical problem was speed. Testing cribs against every possible Enigma configuration by hand would take decades. The solution was a machine. Drawing on Rejewski's Bomba concept, Turing designed the British bomb. It was an electromechanical device, roughly 2 meters tall, 2 meters long, and 1 meter wide, containing 36 sets of rotor drums that could work in parallel at high speed. Operators who worked with them described the machines as looking like great big metal bookcases. The first bomb, named Victory, was installed at Bletchley Park on the 14th of March, 1940. In August of that year, Gordon Welchman contributed a critical refinement he called the diagonal board, which exploited the reciprocal nature of the Enigma plug board to dramatically reduce the number of false results the machine produced. This improvement transformed the bomb from a promising prototype into an industrial code-breaking weapon. What the bomb needed was time and cribs. Time was provided by the machines working through the night. Cribs were provided by a combination of sources: the predictable phrases that German operators used, the stereotyped format of military weather reports, and the critical flaw that one German Luftwaffe operator famously exploited when, instead of choosing 3 random letters for his message key, he consistently used sequences related to his girlfriend's initials. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park named this class of operator error a silly. By the spring of 1940, Bletchley was reading Luftwaffe Enigma traffic with increasing regularity. The intelligence produced was coded Ultra, a classification above top secret, and it was fed to commanders through a fictional cover story. Reports were given the appearance of coming from a high-placed spy inside Germany working for MI6, codenamed Boniface, to prevent any German investigation from ever identifying Bletchley Park as the actual source. No operational decision was ever to be taken that would allow the Germans to suspect their codes were being read. Ultra intelligence could inform movements, but it could never be directly acted on without a plausible cover explanation. The first real test came in April 1940, when Germany invaded Norway. The codebreakers broke the Luftwaffe Enigma cipher used by the invading forces within a week and read virtually all the intercepted traffic. But the system for distributing intelligence to field commanders was not yet in place, and much of what Bletchley discovered could not be used in time. The intelligence flowed again during the Battle of France, but again, the collapse happened too fast. However, the ultra-intelligence that was delivered to Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 proved its value beyond any doubt. Bletchley identified the exact date and composition of Luftwaffe attacks hours in advance, allowing radar and sector controllers to concentrate defending fighters with a precision that Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's opponents never understood. The critical gap, however, was the sea. By the winter of 1940 and into 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic was going catastrophically for Britain. German U-boats, operating in coordinated groups that Dönitz called wolf packs, were sinking Allied shipping faster than the shipyards could replace it. Bletchley Park could read the Luftwaffe's Enigma. It could read the German Army's Enigma. But naval Enigma, used by the Kriegsmarine, employed additional rotors exclusive to the Navy and far stricter operational procedures than its Army and Air Force counterparts, making it stubbornly resistant to the crib-based methods that were working elsewhere. The solution would have to be physical. On the 9th of May, 1941, the westbound convoy OB-318 was under attack south of Iceland. German submarine U-110 commanded by Kapitanleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, a veteran commander who had been under consideration for court-martial 2 years earlier for sinking the British passenger liner Athenia on the first day of the war, attacked the convoy and sank 2 merchant ships. What happened next sealed Lemp's fate and changed the war. The corvette HMS Albriatia located U-110 on sonar and dropped a pattern of depth charges. The submarine survived the initial attack, but surfaced, seriously damaged and taking on water. Commander Joe Baker Creswell of HMS Bulldog, the escort group leader, immediately recognized what was in front of him. As the destroyer HMS Broadway closed to ram, Baker Creswell ordered it to veer aside and dropped 2 depth charges beneath the submarine to force the crew off the boat without sinking it. He had decided to attempt to board. Lemp, watching from the water, realized what was happening. He turned and swam back towards his own boat, apparently intending to destroy the cipher equipment and codebooks before the British could reach them. He did not make it. The precise circumstances of Lemp's death remain unclear, but he drowned before he could return aboard. Sub-Lieutenant David Baum, 20 years old, led the boarding party from Bulldog's whaler. He later recalled the experience as terrifying. He climbed down into the submarine alone, holstering his pistol because he needed both hands free on the ladder, presenting himself as an unprotected target to any German crew member who might still be below. The submarine was deserted. The German crew had abandoned ship in haste, leaving everything as it was. Ball methodically stripped the wireless room, passing items up the ladder in a chain. Codebooks, cipher charts, instruction manuals, and one object that a radio operator named William Stewart Pollock described as looking peculiar and out of place in the radio room. It was a complete, undamaged, fully operational Kriegsmarine Enigma machine with its rotors set to the current daily configuration. The prisoners were taken to Iceland and held completely isolated from any outside communication. The German crew never learned that their submarine had been boarded. U-110 was taken in tow, but deliberately scuttled the following morning, and every man involved in the boarding was sworn to absolute secrecy. The capture was given the code name Operation Primrose. Even the Americans were not informed for 8 months. When HMS Bulldog reached Scotland, it was met by a liaison officer from Bletchley Park's Operational Intelligence Section, Lieutenant Alan Bacon. His recorded reaction upon opening the packing cases and seeing the Enigma machine was simply to say, "What? This? We've waited a long time for one of these." Bletchley's Hut 8, where Turing's team worked on naval Enigma, had the machine operational within weeks. The immediate results were striking. Allied shipping losses in June 1941 were approximately 432,000 tons. By August, they had fallen to less than 80,000 tons. German supply ships stationed around the North and South Atlantic, whose positions Bletchley could now read directly from naval Enigma intercepts, were systematically located and sunk. King George VI, when he was informed of the capture, told Baker Creswell that Operation Primrose had been the most important single event in the whole war at sea. Back at Bletchley, the station was transforming into something that defied easy description. The original 200 staff had grown to several thousand by 1941 and would reach nearly 10,000 by 1944. 75% of the workforce were women, drawn from the Auxiliary Territorial Service and the Women's Royal Naval Service, operating the bomb machines and processing the flood of decrypted intelligence that poured out of the huts around the clock. A volume of 50 messages decoded per week in 1940 had become 3,000 per day by 1943. The intelligence this torrent produced reached into every major operation of the later war. Ultra told the Allies the precise composition and timing of the German offensive that threatened to trap the 8th Army at El Alamein. It tracked every significant naval movement in the Mediterranean, When the Allied invasion of Sicily was planned for the summer of 1943, Ultra confirmed that the famous Operation Mincemeat deception had worked, and that Hitler had shifted defensive forces to Greece in response to the fake invasion documents carried by a planted corpse. When D-Day was planned for June 1944, Ultra showed that 19 German divisions were waiting for a phantom army commanded by General Patton to attack at the Pas-de-Calais, and that the genuine Normandy landing site remained undetected. Senior historians would later conclude that D-Day was able to proceed as planned in June 1944, rather than 1945, primarily because of Ultra. Churchill, who received his own Ultra summaries every morning, described the Bletchley codebreakers as the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. The Germans introduced increasingly sophisticated improvements to the Enigma throughout the war. Naval Enigma added a fourth rotor in February 1942, plunging the Atlantic code-breaking operation into darkness again. The German Navy designated this configuration Triton. Bletchley called it Shark. For 9 months, Hut 8 worked against Shark with limited success, and shipping losses climbed again. The breakthrough came in October 1942, when 3 members of the crew of HMS Petard boarded the sinking German submarine U-559 and retrieved 4 rotor Enigma codebooks before the submarine dragged 2 of them to their deaths. First Lieutenant Anthony Fasson stripped off his uniform and swam across to the stricken vessel, followed by able seaman Colin Grazier and 16-year-old canteen assistant Tommy Brown. Fasson and Grazier were lost when the submarine made her final plunge. Brown survived. Within days, Bletchley had broken Shark. Fasson and Grazier were awarded posthumous George Crosses. Brown received the George Medal. By 1944, Bletchley Park was reading Hitler's operational orders sometimes hours before they reached the generals in the field. The Colossus computer, an electronic machine with 1,500 vacuum tubes in its first version and 2,400 in its successor, had been built to attack the Lorenz cipher used for the highest level communications between Hitler and his army group commanders. When the war ended in May 1945, Churchill ordered that the bomb machines be broken into pieces no larger than a man's hand. The Colossus computers were destroyed. The files were sealed. Every one of the more than 12,000 people who had worked at Bletchley Park signed the Official Secrets Act and kept their silence. Winston Churchill, in his 6-volume history of the war, mentioned Bletchley Park nowhere. Not one person broke the secret for 3 decades. Several questions remain genuinely contested by historians. The precise degree to which Ultra shortened the war continues to be debated. The most commonly cited estimate, that the intelligence advantage shaved 2 full years from the conflict, comes from a 1997 assessment in Naval History magazine that described Bletchley as having trimmed at least 2 years from the war. Some historians consider this a significant overstatement. Others believe it may underestimate Ultra's value in specific theaters, particularly the Atlantic and North Africa. We can say that the senior commanders who received Ultra throughout the latter part of the war considered it indispensable. That Admiral Sir Dudley Pound's congratulatory signal to HMS Bulldog after the capture of U-110 compared the event to the petals of a rare flower. And that King George VI, presumably not given to hyperbole on matters of national security, told the man who led the boarding party that his actions constituted the most important single event in the entire war at sea. Perhaps the most fitting verdict belongs to Gordon Welchman, the mathematician who extended Turing's bomb design into its most effective form, and who wrote after the war that the entire British code-breaking achievement would never have begun without what 3 Polish mathematicians carried in their heads when they escaped from Warsaw in the autumn of 1939. The geese had indeed never cackled. The question that remains as we look at the wooden huts and the Victorian mansion that still stand in Buckinghamshire is how much of the invisible architecture of Allied victory we still do not fully understand. Thank you for watching. If this investigation gave you something to think about, please comment, like, and share. Subscribe to History Zettel and join us for the next one. The file is never truly closed.